Hi guys! Today we're talking about diarrhea. Have you ever wondered why sometimes you have abdominal pain and need to go to the washroom and you can feel better? And why some people have diarrhea more frequently than the others? They can't even take a little bit of milk or even gluten. Once they take a little bit of milk, they're definitely gonna have diarrhea and other symptoms like vomiting and stuff. Or even if you've noticed, some people's stools even have blood or very sticky mucus on it. And sometimes they only pass fluid. There are no stools in it, you just pass fluid. So why are those things happening? So in this video, I'm going to cover all those questions above. So without further ado, let's get into the video.
As you know that diarrhea can be divided into watery, fatty, or bloody, but that's actually all considered chronic diarrhea. So as you can guess by now, diarrhea is actually divided into acute and chronic diarrhea. Anywhere in between we call it persistent diarrhea. So acute diarrhea is actually less than 14 days, and chronic diarrhea is anything more than 30 days. So anything in between we call it persistent diarrhea, which is 15 to 29 days. So the reason we divide it into acute and chronic diarrhea is basically acute diarrhea is basically caused by infection, because infection will manifest its symptoms very fast within 1 or 2 days. But infection can be divided into virus, bacteria, and parasites. So for viral bacteria, we actually have norovirus, right? Because the virus itself is originated in Norwalk. It's a city in America where the outbreak of gastroenteritis actually occurred among all the children, so we term it as Norwalk virus. Another virus is rotavirus. It basically means wheel. Rota means wheel. And adenovirus. Adeno means gland. Probably invades the gland in our in the mucosa in the colon, okay? Or the lymphoid glands around the colon. And we have astrovirus. Astro means star. Because the virus looks like a star under the electron microscope, so we call it astrovirus. So bacteria, we have Salmonella, Shigella. So these two are caused by eating undercooked. Shigella is eating undercooked pork. Salmonella is eating undercooked. Okay, so both of these cause bloody diarrhea. Okay, bloody diarrhea. And we have E. coli. Depending on the strain, E. coli has a lot of strain. It can even be a normal flora in our gut. But if it is enterotoxigenic E. coli, it will cause watery diarrhea. But if it is enterohemorrhagic E. coli, it's going to cause bloody diarrhea because it invades our mucosa and causes ulcer. And actually, the ulcer is bleeding out. And we have Clostridium difficile, cholera. Cholera also causes watery diarrhea. And we have Campylobacter. This Clostridium difficile is also caused. Okay. So now let's move on to the parasites. Parasite, the first thing is Giardia, or Giardia lamblia. Because this is actually the name of the researcher, so there's not actually a good way of remembering it. And we have Entamoeba histolytica. This one might be more familiar because we already hear it, but the way to remember it is based on histolytica. Histo means tissue, and lytic means break. So as we can guess, the parasite actually breaks the tissue apart in our colon. So when the tissue is break, it's gonna bleed. So this thing causes bloody diarrhea, right? And we also have Cryptosporidium and Cyclospore. So the way that doctors differentiate them is by stool culture or stool CNS, and also stool fluid examination, microscopic examination. We see the stool under the microscope, or we culture the stool. We give the stool the nutrient of the bacteria that we think, and the bacteria lives or the bacteria responds, then we can know the characteristic of bacteria and hence isolating the bacteria itself. And we can test the sensitivity of the bacteria to certain antibiotics by giving a lot of antibiotics to it and see which antibiotic kills the organism best. But some experienced doctor, they might differentiate them by history taking, by asking, is your stool watery or bloody? Have you taken any undercooked meat before? Is it pork? Do you have any fever? If there's fever, I'm gonna suspect virus. So you can actually get some hints or clue in your history taking, but you still need stool CNS and stool FEME to confirm your diagnosis. Now, let's move on to chronic diarrhea. So chronic diarrhea is usually due to underlying diseases, long-lasting diseases. It's not acute anymore. So, let's differentiate it based on what we know. Watery, fatty, bloody. For watery diarrhea, we actually can further divide it into secretory, osmotic, and functional. So I actually want to explain the mechanism behind secretory, osmotic, and functional diarrhea, okay? So secretory diarrhea is actually something secreting water into your gut lumen. So this is our gut, or our colon. Let's start with secretory diarrhea. Secretory diarrhea is when the bacteria, let's say this is bacteria, the bacteria actually can secrete toxins. We call it endotoxins, enterotoxins. So these toxins can let our stool become watery. Or sometimes we can have tumors, right? Let's say we have a tumor here. It's a tumor. Sometimes this tumor can secrete fluid itself. They secrete fluid itself. So we can know some of the cause of secretory diarrhea already. So first is bacterial endotoxins, such as cholera. Or sometimes it can be tumor. And also certain medications can also cause diarrhea, right? Like augmentin or NSAIDs. Now let's talk about osmotic diarrhea. The stool itself, it consists of a lot of things, a lot of solutes. That makes it hypertonic. So this hypertonicity actually pulls water from the cells. So these are the cells, right? Cell, the gut cell. It actually pulls water from it because these things, these hypertonic things, so it has a concentration gradient that pulls water from the cell. So what are the things inside it that may achieve this effect? So some of the examples are short-chain carbohydrates, lactose. If some person has lactose intolerance, like milk intolerance, milk contains lactose, right? Lactose cannot be absorbed fully in the gut, so it can get expelled out into the feces. So the lactose actually pulls water inside, so whenever someone drinks milk, they're gonna have diarrhea, right? And there's another thing called celiac disease. It's actually gluten intolerance. That is why a lot of people say we're actually eating gluten-free food, gluten-free, because they have celiac disease. Whenever they eat gluten, they're gonna have diarrhea. Sometimes the use of osmotic laxatives can also cause diarrhea. But the overuse of osmotic laxatives can also cause these effects. But now let's talk about functional diarrhea. Functional basically means it's relating to the function of the gut itself. There's no tumors, no infection, no anything. It's the function of the peristalsis itself. It's either too fast, which means the gut is contracting so fast, it hasn't absorbed enough water from the stool, so the stool is still watery and already passed out, causing diarrhea. Or it can be too slow. If it's too slow, then the water is absorbed too much and the gut can't even move, it's dried, causing constipation. So whatever it's related to function, we call it irritable bowel syndrome. So I actually want to talk about irritable bowel syndrome here. There are a few types. It's either IBS, C, constipation, or IBS, D, diarrhea. Okay, they're very mixed. So you can have constipation and diarrhea at the same time. Now, this is a tricky one. How can someone have constipation and diarrhea at the same time? Now, I'm gonna explain this. Say you have constipation, right? There's a stool over here at your rectum. There's a stool at your rectum. It's blocking the way for like 7 days, right? Stool blocking for 7 days. Haven't come out yet. But then what happens is that when your stool is blocking the way, the new stools are coming in. New stools are coming in. And sometimes these stools can be watery. At the first few days you have very hard stools, but after that your gut may be returning to normal functions and it can be diarrhea. But you don't know it because they're all accumulating behind your stool. So now, your constipated stool suddenly gets removed one day. Hooray! That's good news! But what also happens is the fluid behind it also all comes out all together. So this is why someone can have cause in time, right? Another cause is when you have a tumor. Let's say you have a tumor here, and this tumor is blocking 2/3 of your lumen. So you only have a very small passage of letting the stool pass. So this can cause constipation. But the tumor itself is secreting fluid. So you can have watery diarrhea. But the stool can come out at the same time, so it actually can cause bloating or in the upper part, in the part proximal to the tumor. So this is why you can have constipation and diarrhea at the same time. So talking about irritable bowel syndrome, it's actually classified by two things. You can have abdominal pain and abnormal bowel movement that improves after you pass your stool. So the reason someone have abdominal pain is because the stretch receptors, also known as a pain receptor, whenever it's stretched too much, our abdomen can have pain. So this is why when we are constipated for a few days, our feces actually compresses it, stimulating this stretch receptor causing pain. But in irritable bowel syndrome, some people, the stretch receptors are more sensitive, which means a little bit of stretching can make them feel abdominal pain. And then whenever we pass this stool out, this stretch receptor is no longer stretched, so we don't feel the pain anymore. So, moving on to fatty. Fatty, we have a name for it, called steatorrhea. So if your stool is fatty, it can mean two things. The first thing, our fat is not being absorbed properly in our small intestine. The second reason, the enzyme like lipase are not being secreted, which means the fat is not even being broken down into smaller pieces. This is maldigestion. Oh, one thing I forgot just now. Alcoholism can also affect the movement of our bowel. So alcoholism can lead to IBS. So let's talk about malabsorption first, right? There are a few things that can affect the absorption. The first is infection. The bacteria actually affect the bacteria in colon affect the absorption of nutrients effectively. The next is surgery. In some surgery, like they remove part of the intestine, so our intestine actually becomes shorter. We have less time to absorb appropriate nutrients before it's being passed out as stool. It can cause malabsorption. And also some disease like celiac disease. Celiac disease is about gluten, malabsorption of gluten. But sometimes it causes fatty steatorrhea as well. But maldigestion, sometimes it can be because of pancreatitis or pancreatic insufficiency, which the pancreas cannot secrete enough lipase. Lipase is the thing that breaks our lipid down into absorbable fat. So without lipase, we cannot absorb fat. Sometimes it can also be caused by bile acid malabsorption. So we can have less bile acid in our body. The function of bile acid is also to break down fat. Now let's move on to bloody. Bloody diarrhea usually signals a more serious underlying cause, like tumors, or inflammation, or infection. Let's talk about these. If we have a tumor here, this tumor can invade. We call it invade the mucosa. And once it invades the mucosa, it can invade the blood vessels. Then it can cause bleeding, blood, or sometimes the tumor can also leak blood itself. Now let's talk about inflammation. Some inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, especially ulcerative colitis, it can cause inflammation of the colon. And once our colon is inflamed, it can actually cause ulcers. And when we have an ulcer here, our blood can actually leak out. Or sometimes infection itself, the bacteria, that invades the mucosa also causing ulcer and bleed.
So now we know the causes, the underlying mechanisms of so many causes of diarrhea. I'm going to tell you what doctor to do in your history taking. So when a patient with diarrhea comes to the doctor, the first thing the doctor will do is ask questions to the patients. I'll say if the patient is, if it's children, I suspect infections. So I will ask if the children has taken any food recently, an unclean food or unclean water recently. But if the patient is an elderly man, I suspect something underlying, something chronic. Like, is this your first time? When was the last time you have diarrhea? Or I might even ask if your stool has some blood in it, if your stool has some mucus in it. I think it was something more serious, like very insidious colon carcinoma. Or I might even ask about, do you take any food before you have diarrhea? I suspect something like celiac disease, like gluten intolerance, or lactose intolerance. So after we take our history and we have a pretty good idea about what is causing the diarrhea in the patient, the next thing doctors will do is physical examination. We examine the patient. So the main thing we're looking about right here is actually dehydration. So this dehydration, especially in children, can cause death. But before that, I want to talk about why diarrhea can lead to dehydration. What are consequences of it?
So now let's talk a little bit about dehydration right here. Dehydration is a complication of diarrhea because we lost a lot of weight during diarrhea. So what are the signs of dehydration? The first thing is notice is cold periphery, cool skin. We just use a thermometer of patients and we see the temperature is lower than normal. Then we have dry skin mucosa. This is especially obvious around the lips of the patient, and loss of skin turgor. This means the patient's skin is not as bouncy like normal people like us. And the way you can test this is by pressing on the patient's skin, and usually our skin will return to normal. It will be white at first, but it will return to normal within 2 seconds. But in those dehydrated patients, when you press on it, maybe it takes a longer time, like more than 3 seconds to return normal, right? So why does patient have cool peripheral, cool skin? Alright, let's talk about this. When we lose weight, our blood volume reduces because our blood consists of most of the water in our body, right? So what happens when our blood volume reduces? It means we have less blood. So this can get very serious. So when this gets serious, the condition we know as is shock. Shock means there's reduced circulation in the body, right? So if the shock is due to reduced blood volume, we call it hypovolemic shock. So hypovolemic shock, the first thing we notice is increased breathing and tachycardia, which means our heart is pumping faster than it usually should. This is pumping faster for those little blood pumped to all our body. And what happens to our muscle is our muscles actually don't get enough oxygen. So they're entering anaerobic respiration, hence our muscle is releasing more lactic acid. This lactic acid buildup can actually cause metabolic acidosis in our body. So our body becomes very acidic. So the way to remove this acid is by taking more oxygen. We have to increase our breathing rate, taking more oxygen to metabolize all those lactic acid in our body. So this is why we have increased breathing rate and metabolic acidosis in our body. So if this metabolic acidosis gets serious, we can have very deep type of breathing, like we breathe very deeply, like this. We call it as Cosmo breathing, right? Cosmo breathing.
Okay, so now we decided that the patient is dehydrated and decided to hospitalize the patient. So what are we going to do in the hospital? What investigation that we are going to take to monitor the status of the patient? So of course we have to assess the fluid status of this patient. So the easiest way to assess the fluid status of the patient is actually by input and output chart. We monitor the urine output of the patient every day, okay? Because if a fluid volume is reduced, you will have less urine output. The next thing that we're going to do is take a blood sample from the patient and see if the full blood count actually reduces. The next important thing that we're going to do is take the stool culture of the patient, because we want to isolate the bacteria or organisms that are causing the diarrhea if we suspect any gastroenteritis in children. So what we're going to do is we're going to give the patient 2 little sample bottles. One for stool FEME, like I said just now, one for stool culture and sensitivity. But if it is an older patient with something we suspect, maybe he has bloody diarrhea, so we suspect something more insidious like tumors or colon carcinomas, or even polyps or diverticulitis, maybe we can schedule a colonoscopy. We put a scope inside the patient's anus to actually see on the camera what is actually going on in it. So now we done all the tests that we can, and the results all come out, and we confirm that it is an infection. It's a gastroenteritis infection. The main thing that we're going to do now is 2 things. One, give antibiotics or antivirals to destroy all the organisms in the body. The second thing that we're going to do is rehydrate the patient. So if the dehydration is not very severe, like it's only mild dehydration, like skin turgor is still okay, then maybe we can give oral rehydration salt. So water can actually be reabsorbed from the gut lumen into the cells. And fortunately enough, this oral rehydration salt can be acquired anywhere. Just go to the pharmacy and you can buy a pack of it like around 30 ringgits. Or you can even make it yourself at home. It's very easy and simple and effective. But if the dehydration gets severe enough, then we need fluid resuscitation, which means we need IV fluid for the patient. Alright, just keep this in mind. Whenever we give IV fluid, there must be a speed when we're giving it. We cannot give it too fast, we cannot give it too much. So what we do is actually we calculate the fluid required by the patient by the body weight itself. Like the body weight now and the body weight before, like how many kg they lose, how many percent they lose. And we adjust our volume of the fluid based on that. And the speed is usually within 12 hours in normal patients. And when we think the patient is stable and there are no diarrhea left and the body is rehydrated, then we can discharge the patient. When we discharge the patient, we have to remind the patient that to avoid eating those undercooked meat. We have to cook the meat thoroughly before we can eat it and make sure the water is clean, maybe install a water filter in the house. And if they haven't get the vaccination already, or rotavirus or some bacteria, just get it done. Get it done already, so we can avoid similar things from happening in the future. Alright guys, so that's about everything I want to tell you today. So if you think I missed anything that did not cover in the video but it's very important for you to know, please just add it in the comment section below. So if you find this video useful, please hit the like button and maybe comment. And please subscribe to the channel if you think this is useful. And with that, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.